Marched Sane, 9,900 dry on Bletchley Park, Buckinghamshire, England. The night was bitter cold, the kind that crept through brick and mortar, through wool and flesh, settling deep in the bones. Inside Hut 6, beneath flickering electric lights that hummed with wartime rationing, a young woman named Margaret sat before a mechanical beast of rotors and wires. Her fingers, stained with ink and cramped from 16-hour shifts, moved across the keys of a captured Enigma machine with the precision of a concert pianist. Outside, the English countryside slept under blackout curtains, unknowing, while inside these wooden huts, a silent war raged, one fought not with bullets and bayonets, but with mathematics, intuition, and an American urgency that would reshape the very nature of warfare itself. The machine before her clicked and whirred, its rotors spinning through millions of possible combinations, each one a locked door behind which the Third Reich hid its secrets. She did not know that across the Atlantic, in a nondescript building in Washington, D.C., American cryptanalysts were at that very moment unraveling a variant of this same cipher that German naval officers had sworn was unbreakable. She did not know that the messages she would help decode tonight would save 3 convoy ships carrying 10,000 tons of grain and medical supplies to Soviet Russia. She only knew the rhythm of the work, the exhaustion, and the whispered prayer that her calculations were correct. This was the hidden battlefield of the Second World War, where the clash of empires happened in silence, where genius met arrogance, and where the presumptions of German military intelligence would collide with an American determination they had catastrophically underestimated. To understand the magnitude of what happened in those crucial months of 1942 and 1943, one must first understand what Enigma represented to the German war machine. It was not merely a cipher device, it was the technological manifestation of Prussian confidence, a machine built upon layers of mathematical complexity that its creators believed placed German communications beyond the reach of enemy intelligence. The device itself was deceptively compact, resembling a typewriter housed in a wooden box, portable enough to be carried to frontline command posts, robust enough to withstand the rigors of mechanized warfare. The mathematics underlying Enigma were formidable. 3 rotors, each containing 26 positions, could be arranged in any order, creating 17,576 possible starting positions before a single letter was even typed. Add to this the plug board, a panel of cables that could swap up to 13 pairs of letters, and the number of possible configurations exploded into the hundreds of millions. Each day, at midnight Berlin time, every German military unit across Europe, North Africa, and the Atlantic changed their Enigma settings according to codebooks distributed monthly, locked in weighted bags designed to sink if a ship or submarine faced capture. German cryptographic officers had studied the history of codebreaking. They knew of the Zimmermann telegram, decoded by British intelligence in 1917, which had helped draw America into the First World War. They had examined the failures of simpler substitution ciphers. They had war-gamed scenarios where an Enigma machine might fall into enemy hands. And after every analysis, every mathematical review, every security assessment, they arrived at the same conclusion: even with a captured machine, even with knowledge of how the device functioned, the sheer astronomical number of possible daily settings made the cipher effectively unbreakable through brute force. To test every possible configuration would require more time than the universe had existed. This was not mere arrogance. This was the considered judgment of Germany's finest mathematical minds, endorsed by the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, ratified by the Kriegsmarine, trusted by every level of German military command from platoon leaders to the Führer himself. Enigma was supposed to be Germany's invisible shield, allowing its U-boats to hunt in wolf packs across the Atlantic, its panzer divisions to coordinate lightning strikes across the steppes, its Luftwaffe squadrons to mass in secrecy before devastating bomber raids. The machine was Germany's nervous system, and the Germans believed that nervous system was protected by mathematics itself. What they did not account for, what they could not conceive, was the nature of American industry when wedded to British ingenuity, the sheer scale of resources that democratic nations could marshal when survival itself hung in the balance, and most critically, the particular kind of innovative thinking that flourished in societies where questioning authority was not treason but tradition. The story began not in the gleaming universities of the Reich, but in the cluttered offices of Polish military intelligence in the 1930s. While German engineers perfected their machine, Polish cryptanalysts, driven by the existential threat of their geographical position between Germany and Soviet Russia, had achieved what the Germans thought impossible. Marian Rejewski, a young mathematician from Poznan, had reconstructed the internal wiring of the Enigma rotors through a combination of mathematical analysis and a few precious scraps of information obtained through French intelligence. By 1938, the Poles were reading German military communications with remarkable consistency. But the Polish operation was fragile, dependent on limited resources and the specific Enigma configurations then in use. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the cryptanalysts fled west, carrying with them reconstructed Enigma machines and, more importantly, their mathematical methods. They found their way to France, and then as France fell in 1940 to Britain. What they brought was not a solution. German upgrades to Enigma had already outpaced Polish capabilities, but a foundation proof that the impossible was merely improbable. The British established their codebreaking centre at Bletchley Park, a Victorian mansion in the Buckinghamshire countryside, deliberately unremarkable, deliberately forgettable. They recruited an extraordinary collection of minds, mathematicians from Cambridge and Oxford, chess champions, linguists, crossword puzzle enthusiasts, anyone whose brain was wired to see patterns where others saw only chaos. Alan Turing arrived in 1939, a brilliant and awkward mathematician whose theoretical work on computing machines would posthumously earn him recognition as one of the fathers of computer science, but who was then simply another eccentric genius among dozens. The British made progress. Turing and his colleague Gordon Welchman designed the Bombe, an electromechanical device that could test thousands of Enigma settings per hour, exploiting weaknesses in German operating procedures. By 1941, Bletchley Park was reading some German communications, particularly Luftwaffe messages, which German airmen encoded with less discipline than their naval counterparts. But the operation was chronically under-resourced. Britain was fighting for survival. Every pound of copper, every engineer's hour, every mathematical mind had to be rationed as carefully as butter and fuel. And then came the variants. December 1941. The Atlantic Ocean, 400 miles west of the Hebrides. The U-boat commander stood in the conning tower, salt spray freezing on his leather coat, watching through Zeiss binoculars as the merchant convoy crawled across the horizon. 23 ships in 9 columns, tankers heavy with aviation fuel, freighters loaded with steel and grain, destroyer escorts zigzagging on the flanks like nervous sheepdogs. He had been tracking them for 6 hours, maintaining a parallel course just beyond visual range, waiting for nightfall. In the radio room below, his communications officer was encoding a message on the Kriegsmarine's newest cipher system, Enigma M4. This was the German Navy's answer to concerns about cipher security, a four-rotor variant with an additional layer of complexity that multiplied the already astronomical number of possible settings by another factor of 26. The message was brief: convoy position, speed, course. Within 2 hours it would reach U-boat headquarters in Lorient, France, where staff officers would vector 5 additional submarines toward this concentration of Allied shipping. By dawn, the wolf pack would strike. What the commander did not know, what he could not know, was that his message would never arrive unopened. He did not know that Bletchley Park had gone dark on Kriegsmarine traffic, that the introduction of the four-rotor Enigma in February 1942 had blinded British intelligence to U-boat movements, that merchant ship losses in the Atlantic had consequently spiked to catastrophic levels. He did not know that the weight of solving this new variant was shifting across the ocean to America. And he certainly did not know that American cryptanalysts, working with an intensity born of national crisis, would crack his unbreakable cipher in a fraction of the time German security experts had calculated as mathematically necessary. America entered the war with surprising capabilities in cryptanalysis, capabilities that German intelligence had profoundly underestimated. The US Navy's OP-20 gear and the US Army's Signals Intelligence Service had been quietly working on cipher systems throughout the 1930s. They had achieved a breakthrough against Japanese diplomatic codes that would pay devastating dividends at Midway. But Enigma presented a different challenge, a challenge that required not just cryptanalytic genius but industrial scale. This is where the fundamental miscalculation occurred. German security assessments had assumed that any attempt to break Enigma variants would follow the pattern of traditional cryptanalysis, a handful of experts working in isolation, using captured equipment and mathematical analysis, chipping away at the problem with limited resources. This model fit the European pattern of warfare, where nations husbanded resources, where industries were still partially mobilized, where the distinction between military and civilian spheres remained relatively clear. But America in 1942 was becoming something unprecedented in human history, an industrial colossus fully mobilized for total war, with a civilian economy that could be transformed into a military arsenal while still feeding its population, a tradition of mass production that could be applied to problems far beyond assembly lines, and critically, a collaborative approach to problem-solving that linked universities, corporations, and military agencies in networks of shared urgency. When the British approached the Americans about the Enigma problem, they brought not just technical specifications, but a culture of secrecy so profound that only a handful of American officials would be briefed on the project's true nature. The US Navy established its own Bombe program, but with a distinctly American flavor, bigger, faster, more ambitious. If Britain could build bombers that tested thousands of settings per hour, America would build machines that tested hundreds of thousands. The engineering was assigned to the National Cash Register Company in Dayton, Ohio, a choice that epitomized American pragmatism. NCR made mechanical calculators and registers. Its engineers understood precision manufacturing, electrical circuits, and the challenges of building reliable machines that had to perform repetitive operations millions of times without failure. By April 1943, NCR was producing American bombs at a rate that would have seemed fantastical to British engineers, massive machines weighing more than 2 tons each, containing over 1 million components, capable of testing Enigma settings at speeds that matched the output of multiple British bombs combined. But hardware was only part of the equation. The Americans brought operational research to cryptanalysis in ways that transformed the field. They recognized that breaking Enigma was not a single problem but a system of interconnected challenges, intercepting radio messages, cataloging them, identifying which cipher system was in use, determining probable message content, exploiting operator errors, coordinating between multiple bomber machines, translating decrypted German, prioritizing which decrypts needed immediate attention, and most delicately, disseminating the intelligence in ways that didn't reveal the source. At Nebraska Avenue in Washington, D.C., in a former girls' school hastily converted to military use, many were women, waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, who operated the bombs, maintained the machines, logged results, and managed the paperwork that transformed raw decrypts into actionable intelligence. Their work required extraordinary attention to detail. A single error in setting up a bomber run could waste hours. A misread letter could send an entire analytical effort down a dead end. The Germans had assumed that the complexity of Enigma, multiplied by the regular changes in settings, multiplied by operational security measures, would create an insurmountable barrier. They had calculated that even if an enemy captured a machine and understood its principles, the time required to break each day's settings, let alone catch up with the continuously evolving variants, would render the intelligence too stale to be useful. They were wrong on every count. February 12, 1943. The call came through at 2:17 in the morning. Commander Joseph Wenger, chief of the Navy's cryptanalytic operations, had been asleep in his office, not unusual during this period, when the boundary between day and night had ceased to have meaning. The phone's ring cut through the artificial silence of the secure facility, and he was awake instantly, the adrenaline of wartime command overriding exhaustion. "We have a break on Shark," the voice said. Shark was the Allied codename for the four-rotor Enigma variant used by Atlantic U-boats, the cipher that had been bleeding Allied shipping for 11 months. the cipher that had drowned thousands of merchant sailors in the black waters of the North Atlantic. Wenger crossed the building to the analysis room in 4 minutes. The scene was controlled chaos. Radio intercepts pinned to corkboards, sheets of handwritten calculations covering every horizontal surface, the steady clicking and humming of tabulating machines processing data. A young lieutenant named Jim was standing by one of the bombs, this one nicknamed Adam, watching as it completed its run. The breakthrough had come from a combination of factors. A weather ship captured in October had yielded codebooks that provided a starting point. Crisp radio intercepts from Atlantic monitoring stations had provided the raw material. A German U-boat operator's mistake, resending a message with slightly different settings, had created a crib, a piece of known plaintext that could guide the bomb's search, and most importantly, the sheer processing power of the American bombs had allowed analysts to test variations that would have taken British machines days or weeks. How long was the run? Wenger asked. 11 hours, Jim replied. Started yesterday afternoon. Adam found a stop at 1907. Beta and gamma rotors, ring settings matching the February schedule. 11 hours. For a cipher the Germans considered unbreakable. For a variant introduced with mathematical assurances that it would take weeks or months per message to attack. 11 hours from raw intercept to readable German. The decrypted message was mundane in content. A U-boat reporting its fuel status and requesting rendezvous coordinates, but its implications were revolutionary. The process worked. The four-rotor variant was vulnerable. American industrial capacity, wedded to British cryptanalytic insight, had achieved what German security experts had calculated as impossible. Within weeks, OP-20G was breaking shark traffic with increasing regularity. Not every message, not even every day's traffic. The process still depended on cribs, on operator errors, on the vagaries of radio propagation, but enough to begin routing convoys around wolf pack concentrations, enough to vector anti-submarine aircraft toward U-boat locations, enough to shift the mathematics of attrition in the Battle of the Atlantic from catastrophic to manageable. The Germans noticed, of course. U-boat commanders reported mysteriously efficient enemy convoy routing. Naval intelligence officers documented the suspicious tendency of Allied aircraft to appear near submarines with uncanny precision. Security reviews were conducted. The possibility of cipher compromise was considered, war-gamed, analyzed, and dismissed. The mathematics, they reasoned, had not changed. The cipher was still predicated on astronomical numbers of possible settings. Captured U-boats confirmed that codebooks had been destroyed before capture in almost every case. The variants had been introduced precisely to increase security. The conclusion reached again and again by German cryptographic experts was that the enemy must have other sources. Better radar, direction-finding equipment, acoustic detection, perhaps traitors within the German command structure. But not Enigma, not the cipher that mathematics itself protected. This was the tragic flaw in German operational security, an absolute faith in their own calculations, an inability to conceive that their enemy might approach the problem with fundamentally different resources and methods. German cryptanalysis was superb. Their own codebreakers had achieved significant successes against Allied codes. But German security assessments assumed equivalence, that British and American capabilities were roughly comparable to German capabilities, scaled by population and industrial capacity, bounded by the same constraints of time and resources. They could not imagine, because nothing in their experience suggested it, the scale of what America could mobilize, not just the bombs, massive though they were, but the entire infrastructure, the network of monitoring stations ringing the Atlantic, listening to every whisper of German radio traffic, the transcription centers where waves typed up intercepts with meticulous accuracy, the IBM punch card machines adapted to sort and catalog encrypted messages, the telephone lines and teletype networks that linked Bletchley Park with Washington, sharing cribs and settings in near real time, the operational intelligence centers that transformed raw decrypts into naval orders within hours. the security protocols that kept the secret so tightly held that German intelligence never captured a single Allied document explicitly describing the codebreaking effort. This was American abundance, applied to the problem of secrecy, overwhelming the challenge not with individual genius, though genius was certainly present, but with systematic organization, industrial capacity, and a pragmatic willingness to throw resources at problems that European nations, ground down by years of war, simply could not match. The human cost of Enigma breaking is difficult to calculate precisely because its success depended on that success remaining secret. When a U-boat was sunk because ultra-intelligence, the Allied codename for Enigma decrypts, had revealed its position, the official record attributed the kill to radar or sonar or chance encounter. When a convoy was routed away from a wolf pack, the merchant sailors never knew how close death had come. The mathematics of absence, of ships not sunk and lives not lost, cannot be tallied with the same precision as losses. But some numbers suggest the magnitude. In November 1942, before the four-rotor Enigma was consistently broken, Allied losses in the Atlantic reached 119 ships totaling over 700,000 tons. By May 1943, with shark traffic increasingly readable, U-boat losses spiked to 41 submarines in a single month. Losses so catastrophic that Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew his U-boats from the North Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic, which Churchill later called the only campaign that truly frightened him during the entire war, turned not on a single decisive battle, but on this invisible advantage, the ability to read the enemy's mail, to know where his submarines would hunt, to route supply convoys through empty ocean, while anti-submarine forces concentrated where the wolves were gathering. Consider the symbolic weight of this Germany, the nation that had revolutionized military planning, that had elevated the general staff concept to an art form, that prided itself on technological superiority and operational efficiency, was being systematically outmaneuvered, not through superior tactics or bravery, but through superior information processing. The German military machine, for all its precision and discipline, was making decisions based on incomplete information, while the Allies increasingly operated with near-perfect knowledge of German intentions. And the Germans, even when they suspected something was wrong, could not bring themselves to believe that the fault lay in Enigma. The machine had become more than a tool. It had become a symbol of German technological supremacy, a mechanical manifestation of the Reich's self-image as the world's most advanced military power. To admit that Enigma was compromised would require admitting that German mathematical assessments were flawed, that German operational security was insufficient, that the enemy possessed capabilities that German planning had not anticipated. Pride in this case was not merely a personal failing, but a structural weakness. The Third Reich, for all its military prowess, had created a system where questioning fundamental assumptions was increasingly dangerous, where the Führer's intuition overruled expert analysis, where bad news was unwelcome and dissent could be fatal. The organizational culture that enabled rapid decision-making in the early war, the aggressive faith in German superiority, became a liability when that faith blinded commanders to uncomfortable truths. April 28, 1943 Bletchley Park. Hugh Alexander, one of Britain's finest chess players and a senior cryptanalyst in Hut 8, was reviewing the day's decrypts when an American liaison officer arrived with a file from Washington. The file contained Bombe runs from the newly operational American machines, processing capacity that dwarfed what Bletchley could achieve alone. Alexander studied the data with the focused intensity he brought to chess problems, seeing not just individual decrypts but patterns, the emerging picture of German naval operations painted by accumulated intelligence. "They're running 6 bombes simultaneously on related messages," the American said, pointing to the processing notes. "Parallel processing cuts the average time per decrypt by 2/3. Alexander nodded slowly. The British had pioneered Enigma breaking, had provided the mathematical insights and initial techniques. But this industrial approach, treating cryptanalysis as a mass production problem, was distinctly American. It was not elegant in the mathematical sense, not the sort of brilliant individual solution that European tradition valorized. It was brute force made possible by abundance. Abundance of electricity, of manufacturing capacity, of personnel, of the kind of surplus that allowed you to throw 6 expensive machines at a single problem because the alternative, Allied shipping at the bottom of the Atlantic, was unacceptable. "How many machines operational in Dayton now?" Alexander asked. 53, as of last week. They're projecting 75 by June. 75 bombs, each the size of a room, each representing tens of thousands of hours of precision manufacturing, each operated around the clock by shifts of trained personnel. The scale was difficult to grasp. Bletchley Park had been operating on the edge of collapse, constantly short of resources, having to beg for additional funds and personnel. And here were the Americans, approaching the problem with the same industrial logic they applied to building Liberty ships, 14 per day at peak production, or B-24 bombers, or the countless other manifestations of economic power, translated into military capability. This was what the Germans had failed to understand, that American wealth was not decadence but potential, that the nation's industrial capacity could be turned to any challenge, and that problems the Germans considered impossible might simply be expensive, a constraint that meant everything to a Britain on the edge of bankruptcy but meant surprisingly little to an America whose factories were running 3 shifts, and whose greatest challenge was finding enough workers to meet production quotas. The irony was profound. Germany had built Enigma to protect its military communications, to create an invisible advantage through technological superiority, but in doing so, they had created a single point of failure, a machine-based system that once compromised could be exploited systematically. The Allies, reading German mail, knew not just tactical movements but strategic intentions, industrial production, supply difficulties, morale problems. Enigma decrypts revealed the location of U-boats, yes, but also fuel shortages, torpedo defects, training inadequacies, the grinding reality that for all its early victories, the Third Reich was increasingly overstretched, undersupplied, and operating on hope and ideology rather than sustainable logistics. The decryption of Enigma variants was not a single breakthrough, but an evolving campaign, a continuous race between German security improvements and Allied cryptanalytic advances. When the Germans introduced new rotor types, the Allies had to determine their wiring. When new codebook formats appeared, analysts had to identify the changes. When German operators improved their discipline, cryptanalysts had to find new techniques to generate cribs. But the trajectory was clear. By mid-1943, the Allies were breaking Enigma traffic with increasing speed and consistency, while German faith in the cipher's security remained unshaken. This asymmetry, one side knowing that its communications were compromised while the other remained confidently ignorant, created a fundamental imbalance that affected operations across multiple theaters. In North Africa, Rommel's supply convoys were intercepted with suspicion regularity, starving his Afrika Korps of fuel and ammunition at critical moments. In the Mediterranean, Allied intelligence guided naval operations with uncanny precision. In the Atlantic, the U-boat fleet's effectiveness plummeted, and through it all, German commanders never quite grasped what had changed, why their enemies seemed to anticipate their moves, why their coded orders somehow became known to opposing forces. The psychological impact on German personnel is harder to measure but no less real. U-boat crews sent into the Atlantic with assurances of operational security found themselves hunted with increasing efficiency. Merchant ship captains, confident that their position reports were secure, sailed into Allied ambushes. Staff officers planning operations on the assumption that their communications were secret watched as their carefully prepared offensives met prepared defenses. The cumulative effect was erosion of confidence, a growing sense that the enemy possessed some unknown advantage, that the rules of warfare had shifted in ways that German doctrine did not explain. Some German officers suspected the truth. There are scattered records of suspicion, of concerns raised about cipher security, of war games conducted to assess the possibility of Enigma compromise. But these concerns consistently ran up against the same barrier, the mathematical impossibility argument. Experts would calculate the number of possible settings, demonstrate the time required to break a single day's traffic, and conclude that systematic decryption was infeasible. The possibility that the enemy might possess computational resources beyond German estimation, or that Allied cryptanalysts might have found mathematical shortcuts not apparent to German analysis, was considered but ultimately dismissed. This failure of imagination, the inability to conceive that the enemy might approach the problem with fundamentally different methods and resources, was itself a kind of strategic blindness induced by prior success. Germany in 1940 and 1941 had achieved stunning victories through superior operational planning and technological advantages. The Blitzkrieg had worked. The U-boats had been sinking ships at catastrophic rates. The Luftwaffe had demonstrated devastating effectiveness. This record of success created a confirmation bias, the assumption that German methods were superior, that German technology was more advanced, that German planning was more rigorous. When reality began contradicting these assumptions, the response was to seek explanations that preserved the core belief system rather than question the foundations. If U-boats were being sunk, it must be better radar, not compromised codes. If supply convoys were being intercepted, it must be improved aerial reconnaissance, not decrypted messages. The alternative, that a cipher machine approved by Germany's finest mathematical minds might be vulnerable, was too destabilizing to accept without overwhelming evidence, and the Allies were careful to never provide that evidence. June 7, 1943. U-boat headquarters, Lorient, France. Admiral Dönitz stood before the operations map, studying the colored pins that represented his scattered fleet. 41 boats lost in May. 41. The numbers were unsustainable. Crews were calling the Atlantic the death route. Replacement submarines were being sunk on their first patrols, sometimes before they even reached operational areas. Something fundamental had changed in the equation of naval warfare. Radar, his chief of staff said, the explanation they had settled on after weeks of analysis. The British have made advances we didn't anticipate. Centimetric radar that our detection equipment can't pick up. It's the only explanation that fits the pattern. Dönitz nodded, but the doubt lingered. He was a submarine commander himself, had spent the First World War beneath the waves, knew the rhythms of undersea warfare. This felt different. The precision with which Allied convoys evaded his wolf packs, the efficiency with which anti-submarine aircraft appeared over submarines that had just surfaced for routine communications. It all suggested something more than improved technology. It suggested knowledge. "Have we had another security review of Enigma?" he asked. 3 times since January, Admiral. The cryptographic staff is confident. They've calculated that even with a captured machine and codebooks, the time required to break daily settings is measured in months or years. And we know the codebooks were destroyed in every case. The weighted bags work exactly as designed. And yet, Dönitz said softly, looking at the map, at the gaps where U-boats used to be marked, they find us. But absent proof, absent some smoking gun that demonstrated cipher compromise, operational necessity demanded they continue. The Atlantic battle was existential for Britain. Severing the supply lines from America was Germany's best hope of forcing a negotiated peace. The U-boats had to continue hunting, even as the hunters became the hunted, even as the mathematics of attrition shifted against them. What Dönitz could not know, what German intelligence had no way of discovering, was that at that very moment, in Washington and at Bletchley Park, cryptanalysts were reading his staff communications, tracking U-boat positions, monitoring fuel status and patrol orders. His strategic planning, encoded with Enigma and transmitted through radio, was being translated into English within hours and disseminated to Allied naval commands as operational intelligence. The invisible wall of security he believed protected his communications was, in reality, a window through which his enemies watched his every move. The tragedy, from the German perspective, was not incompetence but a kind of rational mistake. Their security assessments were based on sound mathematics and reasonable assumptions about enemy capabilities. Their operational security procedures were rigorous by the standards of the era. Their cryptographic equipment was genuinely sophisticated. What they failed to anticipate was not a flaw in their own systems, but but the unprecedented scale of Allied response. The willingness to commit vast resources to the cryptanalytic challenge, the integration of British insights with American industrial capacity, the organizational innovations that treated codebreaking as a mass production problem rather than artisanal craft. This was, in microcosm, the larger story of the war: German efficiency and technological sophistication meeting Allied abundance and systematic innovation, with the outcome determined not by any single battle but by cumulative advantages in information, production, and resources. The German military machine was superb within its design parameters, but those parameters assumed a certain kind of war, a certain balance of capabilities. When faced with an enemy that could bring fundamentally different resources to bear, not just more tanks and planes, but more information processing capacity, more organizational flexibility, more ability to learn and adapt, the machine's rigidity became a fatal weakness. By the summer of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively in the Allies' favor, though the public explanation focused on improved radar and increased anti-submarine aircraft production. The truth, that German naval communications were being read with increasing regularity, remained among the war's most closely guarded secrets. Churchill later estimated that ultra-intelligence, including Enigma decrypts, shortened the war by 2 to 4 years and saved countless lives. Modern historians debate the precise impact, but the strategic significance is undeniable. The Enigma story illuminates a particular kind of military advantage: information dominance. The Allies did not just have more ships or better weapons, though increasingly they had those too. They had better knowledge. They knew where the enemy was, where he planned to go, what his capabilities and limitations were. This knowledge compounded over time, making Allied planning more efficient, resource allocation more effective, tactical decisions more informed. Consider what this meant operationally. When planning the invasion of Sicily in 1943, Allied commanders had access to decrypted German assessments of Italian defensive capabilities. When preparing for D-Day, they could read German intelligence evaluations of where the invasion might come, allowing them to reinforce the deception operations that pinned German reserves away from Normandy. When coordinating strategic bombing campaigns, they had access to German industrial production reports, enabling targeting of actual bottlenecks rather than guessed priorities. None of this was decisive in isolation. The Allies still had to win battles, still had to manufacture weapons, still had to coordinate complex operations across multiple continents. But Ultra gave them an edge, a margin of advantage that accumulated over thousands of decisions, large and small, until the cumulative weight became overwhelming. And through it all, German faith in Enigma remained largely intact. There were moments of suspicion, instances where compromised operations led to investigations, but the investigations consistently concluded that security breaches must have come from other sources: captured documents, interrogated prisoners, aerial reconnaissance, espionage. The cipher itself was trusted, defended by the mathematical argument that had been gospel since the machine's introduction. This trust persisted even as Germany's strategic position deteriorated, even as defeat became increasingly inevitable. In late 1944 and early 1945, with Allied armies closing in from east and west, German military communications were still being encoded with Enigma variants, still being intercepted, still being decrypted, still providing Allied intelligence with insights into German dispositions and intentions. The machine that was supposed to be Germany's invisible shield had become a liability, a source of strategic vulnerability that German commanders never fully recognized. April 30th, 1945. The city was dying. Soviet artillery hammered the ruins, turning rubble into dust. In the Führer bunker 50 feet beneath the Reichschancellery gardens, the last communications were being sent. Some were transmitted via Enigma, force of habit, in an organization where procedure and protocol had been drilled into every officer's consciousness. These final messages, desperate orders to armies that no longer existed, calls for relief that would never come, fragments of denial and delusion, were intercepted by Allied monitoring stations and decrypted as a matter of routine. The war in Europe was hours from ending, but the code-breaking machinery continued its work, processing intercepts with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized the operation for years. The operators who decrypted these final messages understood their significance. They were reading the communications of a regime in its death throes, witnessing the collapse of the military machine that had conquered most of Europe, and they were doing so using techniques and technologies that the Reich had never understood, had never imagined possible, had dismissed as mathematically infeasible. There is a particular poignancy in those final decrypts, the obsolescence of the machine that had been designed to be unbreakable, the futility of encoding messages that Allied cryptanalysts could read almost as easily as if they had been sent in plain language. Enigma, which was supposed to protect German communications into a glorious future, had instead become an artifact of a miscalculation. The failure to anticipate that the enemy might possess resources and capabilities beyond the parameters of German planning. The story of Enigma is often told as a tale of brilliant mathematicians breaking impossible codes, and there is truth in that narrative. Alan Turing's contributions were foundational. The Polish cryptanalysts' early insights were crucial. The work of countless analysts at Bletchley Park was extraordinary, but to focus solely on individual genius is to miss the larger systemic story, how democratic societies, when properly organized and motivated, could mobilize resources at a scale that authoritarian regimes had not anticipated. The Germans understood efficiency. They excelled at optimizing systems, at creating organizations that functioned with mechanical precision, but they were optimizing for a particular set of assumptions: limited resources, zero-sum competition, hierarchical control. When faced with an adversary that could operate under different assumptions, that could afford to be wasteful by throwing massive resources at single problems, that could coordinate across organizational boundaries without requiring top-down control, that could tolerate the chaos of multiple agencies working in parallel, rather than demanding single-point authority, the German advantage in tactical efficiency was overwhelmed by Allied strategic abundance. This is why the American bombs mattered. Not because they were more elegant than British designs, they weren't necessarily, but because America could build them by the dozens, could staff them around the clock, could dedicate entire facilities to single problems. The NCR factory in Dayton, Ohio, building bombs on assembly lines using techniques developed for cash registers, was a perfect symbol of this approach, taking industrial methods developed for civilian products and scaling them to military problems with a speed and magnitude that German planners had not conceived possible. The women who operated these machines, waves in Washington WRNs at Bletchley Park, represented another dimension of Allied advantage. While Germany increasingly struggled with manpower shortages, pulling men from essential industries for military service, the Allies tapped labor pools that the Third Reich's ideology prevented it from utilizing effectively. The hundreds of female cryptanalysts, machine operators, translators and clerks who kept the Ultra system running were doing work that German military culture would have reserved for men, in a system that had already sent those men to the front lines. There was an irony here too. The Reich that proclaimed itself the wave of the future, that promised a new order of technological modernity, was being outmaneuvered by societies it dismissed as decadent and weak. The democracies that Hitler mocked as plutocratic and degenerate were demonstrating a flexibility and innovative capacity that the supposedly superior fascist system could not match. The industrial giant that the Führer had dismissed as incapable of military production was building not just tanks and planes, but information processing systems of unprecedented scale and sophistication. After the war, the Enigma secret remained classified for decades. The British government communications headquarters continued using modified Enigma machines, selling them to foreign governments that had no idea the cipher had been broken. Not until the 1970s did the full story begin to emerge, and even then, slowly, with many details remaining classified until the 1990s. When the secret finally came out, surviving German officers expressed shock and often a kind of bitter admiration. The technical achievement was undeniable. The scale of the operation was impressive, but more than that, many seemed struck by what the breakthrough revealed about their own miscalculations. Germany had prided itself on technological superiority and rigorous planning. To discover that a fundamental assumption, the security of military communications had been wrong for years, that operations had been compromised, that the enemy had possessed an invisible advantage throughout the most critical campaigns, was to confront a kind of organizational failure more profound than any single battlefield defeat. Some former cryptographic officers maintained that the Enigma system was still mathematically sound, that the Allied success depended on specific circumstances, captured codebooks, operator errors, processing capacity beyond normal expectations. There was truth in these observations, but they somewhat missed the point. The Allies had indeed relied on German mistakes and captured materials, but the success of Ultra was not just exploitation of enemy errors, it was the systematic creation of an information processing infrastructure that could capitalize on those errors at scale. This systemic difference is what the Germans had failed to anticipate. They had war-gamed cipher compromise scenarios, but their wargames assumed limited adversary resources, constrained by the same economic and organizational limitations that Germany faced. They had not imagined an enemy that could dedicate an entire converted girls' school to cryptanalysis, that could build dozens of room-sized computing machines for a single purpose, that could employ thousands of personnel on a problem that German planning assumed would be solved, if at all, by a handful of specialists. The symbol of the Bombe. If one seeks a physical symbol of the Allied cryptographic campaign, it would be the Bombe itself, not a weapon in any conventional sense, not a tool of destruction, but an information processing machine. The Bombe did not kill enemy soldiers or destroy enemy equipment. It simply made visible what the enemy had tried to hide, transformed encrypted chaos into readable text, turned the German military's own communications into an Allied intelligence asset. The machine was, in its way, a perfect representation of a particular kind of power, the power to organize information, to process data at scale, to turn abstract mathematical problems into engineering challenges and solve them through industrial methods. This was power born, not from martial valor or ideological fervor, but from education systems that produced thousands of engineers, economic structures that could mobilize resources rapidly, governmental systems that could coordinate action across agencies, and cultural traditions that valued pragmatic problem-solving over doctrinal purity. The clicking, humming bombs, running day and night in Dayton and at Bletchley Park, represented the industrialization of knowledge work. They were the assembly lines of information warfare, turning out decrypts with the same systematic efficiency that Ford turned out automobiles or Bethlehem Steel turned out ship plates. And in that industrialization lay a fundamental challenge to the fascist worldview. These machines were not the products of a single genius leader's vision, but of collaborative efforts involving hundreds of people, from mathematicians to engineers to machine operators, none of whom individually could have solved the problem, but who collectively created a system that worked. The Enigma machine, by contrast, represented a different philosophy. A complex, clever device designed to create absolute security through mechanical means, to make German communications invulnerable through engineering. It was a fortress built of rotors and wiring, impregnable in theory, impressive in practice, and ultimately vulnerable because its designers had assumed that complexity alone was sufficient defense. The clash between Enigma and the Bombe was not just technological but philosophical. The belief that clever design could create unbreakable security versus the conviction that sufficient resources, systematically applied, could overcome any defensive measure. In the end, the philosophical question was answered practically, the resources won. The Allies did not defeat Enigma through a single brilliant insight, though insights were certainly necessary, but through sustained organizational effort, through throwing people and machines and money at the problem until it yielded. In the final accounting, the German failure to anticipate Allied success against Enigma was not a failure of intelligence or competence in any simple sense. German cryptographic officers were skilled, German mathematicians were world-class, German security procedures were rigorous. The failure was one of imagination, the inability to conceive that the enemy might approach the problem with fundamentally different resources and methods, that calculations based on German operational assumptions might not apply to an adversary operating under different constraints. This failure of imagination was itself a product of prior success. Germany in 1940 had defeated France in 6 weeks, a victory that seemed to validate every aspect of German military doctrine. The Blitzkrieg had worked beyond the most optimistic projections. The combination of operational excellence, technological advantage, and ideological conviction had delivered results that made German supremacy seem inevitable. In that context, why question fundamental assumptions? Why imagine that the enemy might possess capabilities that German planning had not anticipated? But warfare, as the Enigma story demonstrates, is ultimately a learning competition. Victory goes not necessarily to the side that starts with superior systems, but to the side that can adapt more rapidly, that can identify and correct its mistakes faster than the enemy exploits them, that can bring new capabilities to bear as circumstances change. Germany created a superb military machine, but it was a machine optimized for a particular kind of war, and when faced with adversaries that could fight different kinds of wars of production, of resource mobilization, of organizational innovation, the machine's very efficiency became a liability. It was too good at what it was designed to do, too optimized for its intended purpose, to adapt when the terms of competition changed. The Allies, by contrast, demonstrated a flexibility born partly from necessity and partly from the nature of democratic systems. The British, facing existential threat, were willing to try unorthodox approaches, recruiting crossword puzzlers as cryptanalysts, building strange electromechanical devices based on theoretical mathematics, coordinating operations across traditional bureaucratic boundaries. The Americans, entering the war with fresh resources, could approach problems with industrial logic. If one bomb is good, 50 are better. If secrecy requires employing thousands of cleared personnel, then clear thousands. If the problem requires coordination between agencies, create new organizational structures to enable that coordination. This organizational flexibility was itself a kind of strategic weapon, less visible than battleships or bombers, but ultimately as significant. The ability to identify problems, mobilize resources to address them, adapt methods as circumstances changed, and scale successful approaches rapidly. These capabilities determined outcomes as surely as firepower and maneuver. Epilogue: the mathematics of freedom. In the decades since the war, the Enigma story has taken on an almost mythic quality. The brilliant codebreakers who defeated the Nazi cipher, the secret victory that shortened the war, the triumph of mathematics over tyranny. Like most myths, this one contains truth, but simplifies a more complex reality. The breaking of Enigma was not a single victory, but a sustained campaign that lasted years. It was achieved not through lone genius, but through organizational innovation, combining British insights with American resources, theoretical mathematics with industrial engineering, human intuition with mechanical computation. It succeeded not because the Germans were incompetent, they weren't, but because they made calculable assumptions about enemy capabilities that proved incorrect when faced with adversaries that could operate at unprecedented scale. There is a deeper truth here about the nature of totalitarian systems and their vulnerabilities. The Third Reich was organized around principles of hierarchy, efficiency, ideological conformity, and centralized control. These principles delivered impressive results in many domains. German tactical excellence was real. German engineering was world-class. German operational planning was sophisticated. But these same principles created blind spots, a reluctance to question authority, a faith in approved methods, an assumption that the Reich's advantages were insurmountable, a failure to imagine that the enemy might possess different strengths. The democracies fighting the Third Reich had their own problems: inefficiency, bureaucratic infighting, political complexity. But they also had capabilities that totalitarian systems struggled to match: the ability to question assumptions, to try multiple approaches simultaneously, to tolerate dissent and heterodox thinking, to mobilize diverse populations, to coordinate action without requiring top-down control of every detail. These capabilities, diffuse and sometimes chaotic, proved decisive when applied to challenges like Enigma that required sustained organizational effort and innovative thinking. The Bombe, in this light, becomes more than a code-breaking machine. It represents a kind of freedom, the freedom to approach problems pragmatically rather than ideologically, to value results over doctrine, to organize knowledge and resources flexibly rather than hierarchically. It was built by democratic societies, not because democracy is abstractly superior, but because democratic organizations, for all their messiness, could mobilize the particular combinations of talents, resources, and methods needed to solve this particular problem at this particular moment. And that, perhaps, is the ultimate lesson, that complex challenges rarely yield to single brilliant solutions, but require sustained systematic effort. That advantage in warfare comes not just from superior weapons or tactics, but from superior information and organization, that assumptions about enemy capabilities must be constantly tested rather than defended. That diversity of approach is itself a strategic asset. That openness to learning can overcome initial disadvantages, and that the outcome of great conflicts is often determined not on the battlefield alone, but in the workshops and laboratories and offices where information is processed, where plans are made, where resources are organized, where the invisible architecture of modern warfare is constructed. The German officers who designed Enigma were not foolish to trust in mathematics. Mathematics was indeed on their side. The number of possible cipher settings was astronomically large. What they failed to account for was that their enemies would find ways to search that astronomical space efficiently, using methods and resources beyond German calculation. The cipher was as strong as they believed, but strength is relative, meaningful only in context, and the context changed when American industrial capacity met British cryptanalytic insight in an organizational framework that could systematically exploit every German procedural mistake. In the end, Enigma was broken not because its mathematics were weak, but because war is not an abstract puzzle. It is a contest of organized societies, economies, ideologies, and wills. The Allies did not just break a cipher, they built an information processing infrastructure, a system for turning intercepted radio signals into actionable intelligence at scale. They created a capability that the Germans had not imagined possible, because imagining it would have required imagining a kind of societal mobilization, a scale of resource dedication, an organizational flexibility that German planning assumptions had not encompassed. And so the clicks and hums of the bombs, running day and night in converted buildings on 2 continents, wrote a particular chapter in the story of World War II, not the story of heroic battles or grand strategy, but the quieter story of patient systematic effort, of resources mobilized and methods refined, of organizations learning and adapting, of free societies discovering that their very openness and diversity and pragmatic flexibility could be forged into a decisive advantage when survival required it. The German officers never expected America to decode Enigma variants in weeks, because they could not imagine America as it actually was, not decadent or weak or unprepared, but different, organized around different principles, possessed of different strengths, capable of mobilizing resources and coordinating efforts at a scale that German planning had not incorporated into its calculations. That failure of imagination, born from ideology and confirmed by early victories, proved more costly than any battlefield defeat. The war would be decided by many factors, but among them was this: one side could read the other's mail, and the other side never quite realized it. That asymmetry, invisible, undramatic, mathematical, helped tip the balance of history. And in the silent rooms where Bombe processed Enigma decrypts, a particular kind of freedom proved its worth, the freedom to imagine differently, to organize flexibly, to mobilize abundantly, to think pragmatically, and ultimately to know what the enemy wished to hide. That knowledge, accumulated over years and applied systematically across theaters, campaigns, and countless individual decisions, was itself a weapon, one the Germans had given their enemies by assuming their communications were secure, and one the Allies wielded with increasing effectiveness, until the machines fell silent, and the war was won.